Who really killed the Tasmanian tiger? Because it wasn't one spooky night in the bush, and it wasn't some neat little mystery where the answer slipped away with the animal. The evidence points somewhere far less romantic. The thylacine was hunted, blamed, fenced out, and protected only when almost nothing was left. So this case is not really about whether it still survives in some hidden valley. This case is about who pushed it to the edge in the first place. And once you line up the suspects, the answer gets a lot less foggy. First, the victim. The Tasmanian tiger was not a tiger, and it was not a wolf. It was a carnivorous marsupial native to mainland Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. And by modern times, Tasmania was his last refuge. That famous early zoo photo of a female with her juvenile matters, because it cuts straight through the monster myth. This was not some oversized sheep-killing machine from settler folklore. It was a real animal, shy by reputation, pouch-bearing, striped across the back, and built by conversion evolution to look oddly dog-like without actually being a dog at all. Even the earliest European illustration from 1808 shows how quickly people tried to force it into familiar categories. Dog-headed opossum, Tasmanian wolf, Tasmanian tiger. We named it 3 wrong things before we really understood what it was. Now to the lead suspect, persecution. Once sheep farming expanded, the thylacine became the perfect villain. Whether it caused all the losses it was blamed for is another question, but blame was enough. Private bounty systems were operating from as early as 1830, and from 1888 to 1909, the Tasmanian government paid cash for carcasses. £1 for an adult, 10 shillings for a pup. More than 2,000 government bounties were paid, and the real body count was likely higher. That is not incidental pressure. That is a standing reward for dead animals. And the old photographs make the point without needing melodrama. Wilf Batty posing with the last thylacine known to have been killed in the wild in 1930 is not just a historical image. Abe Quarrell standing over another dead thylacine in 1921 is not just another old bush photo. Those are receipts. They show a species treated as a target, then as a trophy, long before it was treated as something worth saving. Then we get to one of the most important images in the whole file, the 1921 Henry Burrell photo of a thylacine with a chicken. For years, that image has done the work of a prosecutor. One glance, and the public story writes itself. Caught red-handed, case closed, poultry thief. But the image is misleading. The animal was in captivity, and later analysis argued the photograph was cropped in a way that hid that fact. One researcher even concluded the thylacine may have been a dead specimen posed for the shop. So one of the most widely circulated proof images against the species may itself have been staged, manipulated, or at the very least, deeply misleading. And that matters, because once an animal gets branded a pest, evidence standards fall through the floor. People stop asking what really happened to the chickens and start assuming the striped animal did it. Now, was bounty hunting the whole case? Probably not. It was the main driver, but not the only one in the room. The thylacine was already on shaky ground. Its range in Tasmania had contracted, settlement pushed into key habitat, prey changed, and the species was boxed into a smaller and smaller slice of the island. Add competition from wild dogs introduced by Europeans, the possibility of disease, and already low genetic diversity, and the picture gets uglier. This is where the size comparison photos and the family zoo shots matter. They remind you the thylacine was not some giant unstoppable apex terror. It was a medium-sized predator trying to hang on while pressure stacked from every direction. A species can survive one problem. It can sometimes survive two, but once hunting, habitat loss, prey decline, disease risk, and low resilience all start leaning together, the floor can fall out fast. And collapse is the right word. Around the time of European settlement in Tasmania, Estimates suggest there may still have been about 5,000 thylacines in the wild. By the late 1920s, they were already extremely rare. In 1928, even the Tasmanian Advisory Committee for Native Fauna was talking about reserving habitat for any survivors. That is the kind of conversation people only start having when the species is already in serious trouble. Then the timeline turns brutal. The last known wild thylacine was shot in 1930. The species finally received legal protection on 10th of July 1936. The last known captive died on 7th September 1936, just 59 days later. That is the part that should sting. Protection came, but it came after the killing, after the decline, after the panic, and almost after the species itself. This is also why the surviving footage hits so hard. What remains of the thylacine on film is not some polished wildlife documentary record. It is scraps, less than a minute from David Flea's 1933 footage of the last captive in Hobart, plus the rediscovered 1935 newsreel clip that added another brief moving glimpse of the species while one was still alive in captivity. That rough black and white motion matters precisely because it is rough and black and white. You see the animal sit, pace, yawn, sniff, scratch, turn. Ordinary actions. No myth, no legend. Just a living creature inside a small enclosure, filmed at the end of its line. The famous 1933 photo from Hobart Zoo and the 1935 footage are not simply nostalgic artefacts. They are the final visual record of a species we let dwindle into a cage and a handful of reels. Even the final chapter comes wrapped in confusion. People still call the last captive Benjamin, as if the case has a clean, settled ending with a name attached. But that name itself is disputed and tied to a story that researchers say was invented decades later. Even the sex of the final captive is argued over. What is not argued is the date. The last known captive died at Beaumaris Zoo on 7th September 1936. So the lesson here is not that the story became clear at the end, it is almost the opposite. The closer the species got to extinction, the more myth started crowding in around the facts. That is what happens when a real animal leaves the world and turns into a symbol before people have even finished telling the truth about it. And that takes us to the sightings. This is the part people want to believe in, because hope is hard to kill. Reports kept coming for decades. Search teams went looking. Rewards were offered. Maps filled with dots. More recently, Tasmania logged unconfirmed sightings, even in the late 2010s. That is why the thylacine never really left the public imagination. But belief is not proof. A sighting is not a specimen. A blurry report is not DNA. A story is not a body. And it is not a breeding population. So yes, the Sightings File explains why the case still feels open in the public mind, but the physical evidence never followed. That is the difference between a legend that survives and a species that survives. So, who really killed the Tasmanian tiger? Evidence verdict? Confirmed. Human persecution was the primary killer. Bounties and direct killing did the heaviest damage. Habitat loss, prey decline, dogs, disease, and low genetic diversity likely helped finish the job. But the main force in this file is still us. Not mystery, not fate, not a vanishing act. An incentive structure that rewarded dead thylacines, a public story that painted them as villains, and protection that arrived when the species was already almost gone. That is the real answer to the title. The Tasmanian tiger was not simply lost, it was pushed out, then mythologized afterwards. And that may be the most human part of the whole case. First, we made it the target, then we made it a legend. If you like this case file, watch the dodo next, because that comeback story falls apart on one brutal problem: the egg.